The series of family-scale gardens that I've been growing in has become a very rich source of learning and has provided some very interesting observations. By focusing on a diversity of methods for developing a growing space and managing vegetable crops, it has enabled me to compare and contrast different approaches and techniques. It has also enabled me to explore things that I otherwise would probably never do, and the polytunnel garden with its protected microclimate growing space is an excellent example of this. If I wasn't managing this crazy project, I would definitely still have a polytunnel and an outside growing space. And in the summertime, I would fill the polytunnel full of all of the heat-loving crops such as tomatoes and peppers and grow everything else outside. But as part of this Red Gardens project, I've been managing this polytunnel as if it was the only growing space that the family might have, which means I'm growing a much wider variety of crops, including many I would not otherwise grow under the protection of plastic. And it's been very interesting to see how differently some of these crops grow in this microclimate, and this has been especially the case with this year's garlic crop. Garlic is a really easy crop to grow outside in the climate of Ireland. Every year I plant cloves in the gardens in the autumn, which overwinter quite well and grow to produce a crop for harvesting in early summer. I've found that these hardy plants can handle the windy winter conditions and are very frost tolerant and will grow slowly throughout the winter season and then will grow quite quickly when the weather warms up. They're generally not bothered by pests, and although the crops are often infected with garlic rust later in the spring, I always get a usable crop. Because they can grow so well outside, it doesn't make a lot of sense to take up some of the valuable growing space in a polytunnel, replacing other crops that can only be productive in the extra heat of this protected environment. But every year I grow garlic in this plastic-covered space, and I've had some fantastic crops. And this season, the crop of garlic from the polytunnel garden is the best that I've ever grown. They were very large and strong plants, not bothered by pests or rust or any other disease or deficiencies, and they produced really big bulbs, bursting with very flavorful cloves. I planted the garlic cloves in this polytunnel bed in early December last year, using cloves selected from bulbs grown the previous season in the same garden. I planted the cloves fairly close together in 5 rows down the meter-wide bed, with a spacing of 15 by 20 centimeters or 6 by 8 inches, fitting 95 bulbs in the 3-meter length of bed. This is the same density of plantings that I've used in this garden for a number of years, with about 33 plants per square meter or 3 plants per square foot. This is a fairly dense planting, with significantly more plants per square meter than 3 of the outside gardens, but a lower density than the intensive garden, and I went with this closer spacing of plants to be able to get more out of this valuable space. Generally, when garlic and most other plants are grown closer together, this results in smaller individual plants, even if the total yield might be bigger, and I have noticed this when comparing the crops harvested from the outside gardens, but the plants in the polytunnel garden definitely went against this trend. Once the harvested plants had had a chance to dry out a bit, and I trimmed off the roots and leaves, the bulbs weighed an average of 135 grams each, for a total harvest of more than 12 kilograms of cleaned and trimmed garlic, which translates to 4 kilograms of garlic produced in each square meter of growing bed. I did lose a few plants because the bulbs were starting to rot, but the rest of them were in excellent shape, with really consistent large size and many of the bulbs measuring more than 7 centimeters across. Looking at the yields I've recorded over the previous years from the same garden using the same variety, method, and density of plantings, the harvest from this year is clearly significantly above the gradual increase in yields that I've seen over the seasons. This is 40% more garlic than I've ever been able to harvest before, which is quite an increase from what I thought was already an excellent yield. Compared to the harvest of the other garlic crops, the polytunnel garden produced more than 3 times what I've been able to harvest from the outside gardens, in what has been a reasonable growing season. And looking at the size of the average typical bulb of garlic that I produced in each of the gardens, there is clearly a significant difference in size, with the individual bulbs from the polytunnel garden weighing more than 2.5 times the average of the outside gardens. So why was the crop of garlic so much better in the polytunnel this year, as well as being significantly better than the same crop grown in the same garden in previous years? I think more warmth is the main benefit, which means that the plants grow faster, which allowed them to grow much bigger before the plants shifted to developing the bulb underground rather than growing more leaves. And it seems that the size of the bulb is directly proportional to how big the plant is able to get before this switch in focus. A lack of wind is also a big part of this, which can cool things down quite a bit, and I suspect that the plant needs more energy and resources to adapt to and survive windier conditions, and to recover from any leaf damage that is caused by stronger storms. While it was quite hot at times during the really sunny weather that we had in the spring, these plants seem to manage the heat quite well, and for the past few months, the weather has been quite cool and overcast, which would have helped to reduce the amount of heat and possible stress on these larger plants. I've also been able to provide more consistent soil moisture, as I've installed both sprinklers and drip line watering systems, and when the plants got more established, the drip line has been quite useful to water the soil without wetting the leaves. I think this drier environment could be the main reason why there was no garlic rust on this crop this year, whereas in the past I've always seen a little bit of this fungal disease on the leaves of this garden. The few bulbs that rotted seem to be directly beside one of the wet points in the drip line, but otherwise the bulbs seem to benefit from this method of watering. The soil has continued to improve in this garden over the last few years and is probably the most developed soil of all the gardens, with soil tests showing the high levels of organic matter and high levels of fertility with a decent balance between all of the main nutrients. I think that the improving soil fertility is one of the key reasons for the continuing increase in the yields from this garden, as well as helping to prevent diseases like garlic rust. And the changes in watering as well as favorable weather conditions have contributed to the extra big yield this season. And apart from a blackbird digging out some of the cloves in search of worms, exposing the roots of some of the young plants, I didn't have any pest or disease issues with this crop. So this one crop of garlic from the Polytunnel garden is definitely the new high bar to aim for, and the yield is much bigger than what I would have thought was possible. I really doubt that I could ever get anywhere near this type of yield from the outside gardens, as the gardens are just too exposed. I do cover the plants over winter with a crop cover or mesh, mainly to keep off the birds and animals, but it also reduces the wind and provides a little bit more warmth for the plants over the winter and into the early part of the spring. This seems to help, but it isn't enough to allow the plants to grow fast enough before they shift to growing the underground bulb. This year I had a reasonable harvest from the outside gardens with some decent sized bulbs. While there was some strong growth in the spring, there had been a lot of rain and cool windy conditions since then, and the plants didn't develop very well later in their growth cycle. A lot of garlic rust developed on the leaves of some of the plants, with significantly more in the gardens with the plants spaced closer together, which apparently is to be expected. But this makes the lack of rust on the really dense foliage in the plants in the Polytunnel garden even more remarkable, especially with so much less air movement, and keeping the leaves dry seemed to really help, something that I can't really do with the outside gardens. Another factor to consider in all of this is the size of the cloves that are planted in each of the gardens. I have been replanting my own garlic cloves for many years, and each season I select the largest bulbs with the biggest cloves for planting the next season's crop. Over so many years, this has helped develop bigger garlic bulbs in general, perhaps with the plants becoming more acclimatized to the specific climate and conditions that I'm growing in. But I also think a lot of it has to do with giving the crop a better start by planting a larger clove that will provide the young plants extra energy and nutrients for the first part of growth, before they had to search for nutrients in the soil. In previous years, I used to select the largest bulbs from all the gardens, with a lot of them coming from the larger crop in the Polytunnel garden, of course, and then planted this mix of cloves across all of the gardens to give all of the plants an equally good head start. But I changed the approach for this season's crop, and planted cloves for each garden only from the best of the bulbs produced from the previous crop from that same garden. I made this change as it seemed like a more realistic process, and I also wanted to avoid planting cloves in the outside gardens that were grown from plants that had become acclimatized to the warmer microclimate inside the Polytunnel. This meant that some of the gardens had significantly smaller cloves to start with, and the Polytunnel garden was planted with much larger cloves, and this no doubt contributed to the difference in the yield. I have found that it's definitely worth growing garlic in a polytunnel, as I can get a huge crop with fewer issues that can be harvested a little bit earlier and still taste great and seem to store better as well. But growing garlic means that I can't use the space for the heat-loving fruiting crops that I also want to produce a lot of, as the garlic is not harvested in time to allow crops like tomatoes and peppers to be transplanted into the same bed. But I can get another crop in after the garlic, and the beetroot that I sowed directly after harvesting the garlic is already well developed, and I should be able to get at least 3 crops out of this section of the garden bed this year. I usually expect that the garlic crop will produce a much lower yield than any other crop I could grow. But that's okay, as a kilogram of garlic is much more valuable in the kitchen than a kilogram of pretty much any other vegetable I could grow. But with this season's epic crop of garlic, the yield is not too far off what I would get from some of the other crops that I grow. And it's definitely possible to grow all of the garlic that we'd use for a full year in an even smaller part of the polytunnel, and still have enough to save cloves for planting next year. If I was only growing food for ourselves and had both outside and protected growing spaces, I might consider growing all of my garlic in the protection of a polytunnel, and that's something that I did not expect to discover with this project.